When we put together the lecture series, we considered tonight's program to be very on topic with the artist's work. And we expected the program would have appeal to animal and especially dog lovers. I'm guessing there's many or some of you in the audience. We're also aware, and I was just talking with someone about this a few minutes ago, that this is a difficult subject, especially if you're an advocate for animals. But as you know, this is a very timely and important topic, and we'll hear more about that tonight. Brad Bolman is Associate Professor of History and Environmental Studies at Tulane University. He is author of Lab Dogs, What Global Science Owes American Beagles, and we do have a couple of copies in our gift shop for sale. In the works is his next book, and I love the title, Rotten Beauty, A Fungal History of the World. And you can read his latest article, A New Prescription for Humanity, Treating All Creatures with Care, in Hot Off the Press, the 2026 Lloydiana. So if you don't have one of those, grab one. Brad earned his PhD in the history of science at Harvard, followed by postdocs at the University of Chicago. After his fellowship at the Lloyd, he headed to a fellowship at the prestigious Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. Please join me in offering a warm welcome to Professor Brad Bolman.
Okay, looks like sound, yep, sound, all right. It'll be tough to live up to that. I'll do my best to make this interesting, and it can be a tough subject, but I take a lightness to a lot of things in life, so we're going to get through it together. All right, I'm really happy to be here. I'm so honored to be invited back to the Lloyd. Spending time here as a fellow was a remarkably productive experience. Ironically, not so much for this project, but for a future project. So in 2 years or so, you'll be able to read the sort of product of my Lloyd time, but I'm just super happy to be back here. I also learned that there's not only a soccer game, but also a baseball game tonight. And I thought about going to the soccer game, so I'm so impressed that you all decided to come here for this talk. All right, so let's jump into it. So if you're an animal lover or you're on social media a lot, you may have seen photos and videos from the recent contests over a scientific beagle breeder in Wisconsin known as Ridgeland Farms. A series of activists broke into Ridgeland now 2 times in an attempt to remove over 1,000 beagles that were being held in the facility both for breeding and for research purposes. What kinds of legal challenges the activists will face is a little unclear right now, but the breeder has been compelled to release most of the dogs that were in the facilities right now, so the vast majority of them, I think, have now been adopted out, according to Wisconsin Public Radio. This is maybe the largest flashpoint in what is actually a longer process that's been going on really since the first Trump administration, and that's the changing situation of dogs in experimental research. Over the last 2 years or so, the National Institutes of Health and the Food and Drug Administration have made major changes to their requirements for animal testing. One of the largest is the one that's sort of being referred to in this article, which is a change that meant that people who are doing research on animals of any kind now are required to also invest in non-animal alternatives. So this is a pretty major transformation in how the federal government funds animal research. And this article says that this is a challenge to, quote, one of the most universal ways that scientists study disease and determine whether drugs are safe and may work in people. So this is a major transformation, and animal activists, critics of government science funding have applauded a lot of these changes. Many scientists have been critical of some of these and pointed out that a lot of these non-animal alternatives don't really work as well yet as people might hope. And as someone who's been studying the sort of question of animal experimentation for about a decade, I think that the situation that we're in today is really different from that of basically any point in anyone's life going up to the present. And that can be illustrated with a kind of earlier example. So if we jump back to February 1946, we find ourselves confronting a very different relationship between dogs and science. So that month, people were invited to a new exhibit at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City titled Really Man's Best Friend, which included an opportunity to see the presentation of that year's Whipple Award. The award, which was named for Nobel Prize winner George Hoyt Whipple, was given to two Dalmatian mixes, shown here, Josie and Trixie, who were test animals at the University of Rochester. Their prize collars were supposed to honor sacrifices made by basically all of the dogs in scientific research, and they were presented by, in the middle, Norman Kirk, who was the Surgeon General of the Army during World War II. His presence was very explicit and intentional, and it signaled this fundamental connection between research on dogs and sort of the safety and success of the American military during World War II. So at this moment, there was a sense that without dog research, there was no such thing as sort of American military success in the conflict. The exhibit was organized by an advocacy group known as the Friends of Medical Research. They were a sort of pro-animal research organization. And the argument of the exhibit overall was that the future of biomedical science involved dogs. There had been enormous breakthroughs in the past, most notably the discovery of insulin by Banting and Best, shown here on the left, which relied on a huge number of dogs, and also on the development of what's known as the Blalock-Taussig-Thomas shunt, which is a procedure that sort of solves blue baby syndrome in newborn babies, which the first successful version of that procedure was done on the dog on right, whose name was Anna. And so at the time of this exhibit, the sort of successes from canine research were heralded as bringing in this brand new sort of successful scientific future. The exhibit argued that the past successes were just a kind of indication of what was to come, and a large majority of Americans at this time would have agreed with the basic presentation here, that the future of scientific research involved animal experimentation. So in my book, Lab Dog, I show how we got from that vision of scientific research to the present that we're in right now, where research on dogs is, I think, if you did a public poll, would come out negatively. And in particular, how did we get to a point where beagle dogs became virtually synonymous with scientific research on dogs, which was not true, as you saw in the 1940s. It's not a coincidence, in other words, that activists are now freeing a ton of beagles. Beagles became kind of the defining laboratory dog in the 20th century. And if you'll allow me the tiniest bit of self-promotion, I'll add that Lab Dog was recently shortlisted for the Pickstone Prize, which honors the 6 best history of science books of the last 2 years. And there are a small number of remaining copies in the back of the room here. I can't imagine a better beach read or vacation read. And out of the generosity of my heart, I will consider signing your copy. So it's a book about beagles, but it's really a history of the laboratory dog, this thing that once seemed essential to scientific research and now is probably going out within many of our lifetimes in terms of a sort of central research subject. I can't cover all of it here, but I'm going to dive into a couple parts of this story, try to expand our perspectives of the human-dog relationship. All right, so first, the basic question: what is a beagle, or really any breed of dog in the first place? So these are surprisingly complicated questions. A Boston newspaper writer in the early 1900s claimed that Cleopatra herself had once owned a beagle, and that beagles littered the British countryside for Rome's arriving centurions. Both of these are exceptionally unlikely. As some wished to believe, beagles were kind of present in human life from the dawn of Western culture. The truth, unfortunately, was that nobody really knew where exactly beagles came from, or even what exactly they were. And so in the words of an early beagler here, truth and fiction are so intermingled that it is difficult to distinguish one from the other. And he was talking about beagles, not politics, although it could have been either. So this is true even for the etymology of the word beagle, that one version of the story about where the word beagle comes from is that it comes from this Old English word beagle, which refers to kind of a small thing. And it makes sense. Beagles are small dogs, so they're kind of small foxhounds. But a lot of the early British Beaglers were dismayed at the alternate possibility that beagle actually comes from this French word beagle, which refers to a kind of gaping throat, the loud howls that beagles make. And this is most likely the case, that it's actually from this French. Linguists would say that it would have palatized if it was beagle. We won't go into it here, but it's probably French, and this made the Americans and the English folks rather annoyed. In her book, The Animal Estate, historian Harriet Ritvo shows that breed names, types, and documentation about dogs were really the product of intense social debate in Victorian England. For many people in England, dog breeding was not just a pastime, it wasn't a hobby, but it was a kind of version of social uplift. It was a way of imagining yourself into a different social situation. And the ambiguity of what a beagle is did not really stop its supporters from doing really intense arguments about this. And so Ritvo writes in the book, "Where there was a name, there was a breed. And where there was a breed, there had to be a standard, a sort of set of rules that define what the dog is." So at the very same time that all these Victorians in Britain were arguing about the beagle was arriving to America, and it was being Americanized. So the very first Beagle Club in the United States was known as the American English Beagle Club, a lot of guys in New York and Pennsylvania. But within only 6 years, they had changed their name from the American English Beagle Club to the American Beagle Club. And part of this argument was that beagles in America had become a distinct kind of thing, and they were now better than those original English beagles. So Americans were kind of breeding a better beagle. As they explained, quote, "The beagle hound has so improved and is now so far ahead of its English brother that the latter is outclassed by its American descendant." And I think it's not hard to kind of read between the lines here that this is also an argument about American identity, right? That Americans were imagining themselves in the late 1800s to be superior to the people who we had come from, as it were. So beagling here is not just a marker of class hierarchy, but a kind of post-colonial critique of British society. And this got kind of ridiculous. So in the 1890s, in this book called The American Book of the Dog, many American dog breeders sort of really exacerbated the patriotic nature of the project. So it says here, "This is an American book describing the American standard of dogs, the appearance of American dogs, and the American diseases of dogs, as well as the American remedies which will cure those diseases." You get the point. There's this notion that there's something kind of fundamentally and uniquely American about the way that we bred and treated dogs at the turn of the century. This extended to the sort of physical foundation of the beagle itself. So Americans developed their own standard of the beagle. Beagles should have a moderately domed skull, eyes soft and lustrous, firm hocks, all the things that you want from a good beagle dog. And for many beagle breeders, the idea was that you could really only get these in the northeast of the United States. So New York, Pennsylvania, to some extent Ohio. Whereas in the South, there were these so-called beagles that were not really living up to the sort of true American beagle type. And if there's one thing that I want you to remember from this sort of early introduction material, it's that what it shows is that dog breeds are inventions, that from the very foundation, the ways that we divided dogs were also ways of using dogs and imagining dogs to serve particular kinds of purposes. So as a few scholars have pointed out, dogs are to some extent technologies, and they've been called on to do different kinds of things, and we'll see a little bit more about that later on. I think what's important to also remember is that few at this time could have imagined that the traits that they were breeding into beagles could make them useful for very different kinds of things, namely scientific research. So if we jump forward a little bit, in 1939, the US National Research Council established a committee on the breeding of dogs for scientific purposes. You're seeing some reports here. You never imagined in your life you would see the 1939 US National Research Committee report on the Council of Breeding Dogs, but here it is before your very eyes. Researchers were really concerned at this time that people were using dogs for all kinds of projects, but these were just random different types of dogs. They were often collected from city pounds, the kind of unused, unclaimed dogs at the pound, and in the book I referred to this as a process of kind of salvage accumulation. The idea was that the dogs were kind of waste, no one was going to use them, so you might as well use them for science. But the problem that a lot of scientists started to feel is that these were so different from each other that you couldn't really trust that one dog experiment in New York was the same as the dog experiment in California. You needed something like a standard or a kind of normal dog that you could do research on. And one of the very first breeds to be kind of offered as a standard was the Irish Terrier. There was a researcher in New York at Columbia University named Irvin Brand. He had bred a bunch of Irish Terriers because they had this condition called cystinuria. And people were inspired to maybe take Irvin Brand's Irish Terriers and make them into a kind of national standard. This was a time where standard things were proliferating in American society. So standard systems of mass production were all over the place to produce machine tools. And scientists were inspired by this kind of burgeoning Taylorist vision of mass sort of standard production. The first standard research animal was the Worcester rat, who had been created just a few years earlier. So they looked at the Irish Terrier, but they also visited a number of other dog colonies that existed at the time, including this one. This is some archival footage of Charles Rupert Stockart's dog colony just outside New York City, in sort of around the Sleepy Hollow area. And you're getting a sense of the sort of early way of keeping research animals. Stockard had a bunch of money. He had gotten a huge amount from the Rockefeller Foundation to create this colony and to build these facilities, but he ran into just countless problems while trying to run this. He didn't know how much dogs were supposed to eat. He didn't really know how to keep them free of diseases. He didn't really know anything about dogs, in fact, before he started this colony. So he spent years just trying to figure out really basic answers to these questions. And this was, in some ways, the first kind of large-scale American research dog colony. Not everyone was sold on the Irish Terriers or on Stockard's kind of mixed dogs. He had sort of Basset hounds and like German Shepherds. And in fact, one Maryland researcher named Magnus Gregerson had actually started his own small beagle colony. A couple of the dogs got sick and they died, so he had to buy the Irish Terriers. But a lot of people saw beagles as a kind of better standard type of dog. This became a bit more consolidated a couple years later when this fellow, Charles Cook Little, who's maybe most infamous for being secretly on the payroll of Big Tobacco, but was also the head of the Jackson Memorial Laboratory in Bar Harbor, Maine, decided to open a large behavior study involving multiple kinds of dogs. Little was a lifelong dog lover. His dad was a kind of dog breeder. He had even judged at a sort of American dog show around this time. And he wanted to study how different dogs would behave under sort of ideal scientific conditions. Rather than using one breed, he and the researchers at Jackson Memorial decided to choose 5 different breeds of dog. So they used Basenjis and Shetland sheepdogs as kind of behavioral extremes, and then 3 sort of normal types of dog: the Cocker Spaniel, the wire-haired Fox Terrier, and of course the Beagle. And although it wasn't really the explicit goal of this research, he also kind of dreamed that by just studying dogs, he would create like a perfect pet research dog that would emerge out of this study, that people would want to keep at home, and they would also want to maybe do research on those animals. And if you know much about the history of dogs, you know that the dogs selected for this project were not so coincidentally the most popular dogs in American society at that time. So for most of the early 20th century, the Cocker Spaniel was the most popular American dog. They have these like beautiful sort of fluffy ears. They're great for certain kinds of hunting, but they were dethroned in the 1950s by the Beagle, which became America's most popular breed in 1954. So the key thing that I want us to remember here is that the ideal scientific dog and the ideal pet dog were kind of related. They were not different subjects. They sort of were interconnected and influenced each other. And this was also a time when what it meant to have a dog in the United States was changing as well. You could all of a sudden go to your local grocery store and buy pre-prepared dog food, which was not possible before the 1940s and the 1950s. American dog ownership was sold as a kind of scientific undertaking. You needed your dog to have good nutrition, eat the right amount of food every day. And Gaines was one of the earliest dog food companies to kind of sell this idea of scientific dog food that your dog likes. And you'll notice that it's a beagle in this commercial, and that's also not coincidental because they were testing a lot of their food on beagle dogs as well. So the development of the laboratory dog influenced the development of the ideal pet dog. The pet dog influenced the laboratory dog. He's so cute. He's having such a good time. But if we zoom out a little bit, though, it's also important to recognize that Americans aren't the only people at this time interested in standard dogs. So in 1958, some French veterinary researchers and pharmacologists begin to debate the le chien de laboratoire, the laboratory dog, the ideal standard dog. They talk about some local examples like German Shepherds or Brittany Spaniels. They also get offered to buy a bunch of American Beagles from the United States that'll get shipped over. Nobody in France really knew what the ideal dog was, but they also shared this idea that you needed to settle on some kind of standard, some consistent type. The same was true in Japan at this time. After World War II, the Japanese pharmaceutical industry was rebuilding after a period of destruction, and Japanese researchers went all around the world to kind of figure out what was happening in the pharmaceutical industry of different countries. And one of the things they found was that Americans and British researchers were using beagles. And you can see here that it's one of the only non-Japanese words because there was no sort of kanji for it at the time. So this idea that the beagle was being kind of imported into Japan as an ideal standard dog. So this is a worldwide change that's happening, and it's really changing what it means to do research with dogs. It's also changing some kind of unexpected things, and one of the more surprising ones is the idea of dog years. So most of us have probably heard this basic idea that a dog's age is its sort of human years times 7. This is a common idea. Dates back all the way to the 1920s. People were saying this in the 1910s and 20s. But actually, by 1954, people were learning that it's not really true. It's a sort of dramatic oversimplification of thinking about dog aging. So the first influential scientific rejection actually came from France, this researcher named Albert Lebeau, who published this study where he looked at the age of dogs, demographic mortality studies, and he created this sort of chart of canine aging that produced a slightly more realistic kind of vision of dog life. And the basic idea here is that dogs age really quickly and then really slowly later on in their life, not just a kind of consistent linear pattern. So putting it in personal terms, my dog Laszlo, who's about 5 years old, would be roughly 36 years old in Lebeau's terms. So not so different from the times 7 calculation, but across the lifespan it changes things a lot. This has been further complicated over recent decades. So this study, which I really like, created this very complicated sort of logarithmic formula that you can plug in your dog's age. I won't go into it here. It's too much. But I like it because it includes this helpful comparison chart of Tom Hanks's age versus a golden retriever's age. In case you ever are likely to forget any of this information, you'll probably remember that. So there are two key factors or two forces that kind of pushed beagles around the world that made them into this universal kind of international standard: atomic bombs and contraceptive drugs. And I get into both of these in a lot of detail, but I'll give you the kind of short Cliff's Notes version of that here. So in the early 1950s, after World War II, 2 large beagle colonies opened in the United States at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City and the University of California, Davis in Davis, California. These were radiobiology labs, and the basic goal in both of these projects was to understand the dangers of radiation to long-term human health. They were thinking about a couple different kinds of people who worked at nuclear reactors, people who were likely to be in an atomic war, which everyone thought was likely at the time, and one of the craziest ideas that existed at this time, which was to produce nuclear-powered jet fighters that the Air Force and Army could fly around. This idea kind of failed because they couldn't really convince anyone that it would be safe to fly around with like a modular nuclear reactor right behind you in the airplane. When these projects first got started, they thought that they would just buy their dogs from local breeders. That was cheap. It seemed reasonable. Beagles were, again, the most popular dog in the US, so it wasn't that hard. But a lot of the humane societies in Salt Lake City and Davis started to complain about this. And they said it's not really ethical to buy from dog breeders, but it is fine if you all breed the dogs inside of the laboratory. So the idea was that it was wrong to buy them from the breeders, but if the lab bred them inside, that would be sort of okay. So that's what happened. And these labs turned into these kind of medium-scale beagle breeding facilities. They were producing lots and lots of dogs and doing a lot of different research projects with them. They emerged at roughly the same time as another laboratory. This is the Cornell Research Laboratory for the Diseases of Dogs in Ithaca, New York, which was a veterinary laboratory, but it also used beagles as its central research subject. Did a lot of research about dog vaccines. If you have a dog and you've vaccinated your dog, you owe almost all of that to research at this Cornell laboratory. They pioneered most of the sort of major dog vaccines. The 1950s was also the time when Snoopy, perhaps history's most famous beagle, first appeared in Peanuts. So this is the first Snoopy strip from October 4, 1950. Looks a little different from the traditional Snoopy that we all know. He got kind of a facelift later on. But so we're in this kind of beagle moment in the 1950s. And the various atomic labs kind of began to form this research network that was called the Beagle Club. There was all kinds of research happening about beagles, and they produced actually a surprising amount of valuable information. So a lot of what we know about radiation risks started out and was sort of confirmed in beagle studies. There is a huge amount of information, and this actually influenced some anti-nuclear politics at the time. It confirmed a lot of what was discovered during Chernobyl and some of the major reactor crises. So these laboratories produced a lot of information about sort of human health, but they also produced a huge amount of information about dogs. Because again, most of the labs that did this research didn't really know how to keep dogs healthy. And the most influential of the facilities was this one at California Davis. And this guy, Alan C. Anderson, was the supervisor of this project. So Anderson wrote about beagles, he talked about beagles, he went all over the place. And he talked not just about nuclear research, but about all the different things that the lab was finding. How do you kennel lots of dogs? How long do dogs live? How do you keep dogs healthy in the first place? This is the place where they pioneered this thing that's known as ventriculocordectomy, or sort of debarking, where they stop beagles from being able to bark. And a lot of people still do this cosmetically for their dogs, which I think is bad. In 1970, Anderson sort of combined all this together in this book called The Beagle as an Experimental Dog, which was the first kind of like Bible of beagle, the Bible of beagle research. And in my limited experience, if you went to almost any biological laboratory at a university after the 1970s, they have a copy of this book somewhere. And they've kind of given them away now, but like they were just everywhere. So everyone had this book, and it allowed researchers with little dog experience to start to use dogs themselves, and in particular, to use beagles for research. And the thing that's perhaps most influential about this is that Anderson formalized the argument for why beagles make good experimental animals. He said they're small, which means that they don't need to eat very much. They're short-haired, so you don't have to cut their hair like some other breeds. They're docile, and they're kind of eager to please, so you can do complicated and painful procedures, and they don't sort of react really aggressively. You can imagine like a colony of German Shepherds. Thousands of German Shepherds would not maybe be the easiest thing to manage. And this argument that Anderson made about why the beagle was kind of the ideal dog spreads everywhere after this book gets published, and it's still something you see a lot in scientific publications about why beagles are good experimental animals. So this atomic research was really important, but the other thing that was going on at roughly the same time is that the United States Food and Drug Administration was opening its own beagle colony. So this opens in July 1954. They had actually used dogs for quite a long time before this, but they were still using the Irish Terriers that I talked about a little bit earlier. They had bought a bunch of these from the Columbia researcher, and they were kind of using Irish Terriers. But not long after, they switched almost entirely to beagles. And the FDA released these kind of toxicity testing guidelines. Don't worry about reading this. It's just there for illustration. And before long, they were saying in these reports that the dog that they used for toxicity tests was the beagle. So everyone who knew that if you had a new drug, a new chemical, and you wanted to get it past the FDA, you probably should test it on beagles. This became the kind of implicit expectation. And this meant that pharmaceutical companies the world over all opened beagle colonies in the early and late 1950s. So Merck, Pfizer, the American Cyanamid Company, Hoffmann-La Roche, Ciba, Norwich Pharmacal, all of these have beagle colonies within about a 5 to 7 year time span. And then they sort of go across the oceans into other countries not long after. This was implicit, it was growing quickly, but the thing that kind of cemented the progress of the beagle was this drug thalidomide. All of you look too young to remember thalidomide, but thalidomide was a kind of pioneering morning sickness treatment that was sort of hailed as a wonder drug because it basically eliminated the problem of morning sickness. The challenge was that they realized after it had already been taken by thousands of women across Europe that it produced stillbirths and sort of different birth abnormalities. America was mostly saved from this, largely thanks to this woman, Frances Oldham Kelsey, who had rejected thalidomide because she didn't think there was enough safety data. So the only reason that we don't have a huge sort of thalidomide disaster history in the US is because of Kelsey. But nonetheless, this kind of international catastrophe surrounding thalidomide led to a lot of debates about drug efficacy, drug reform, drug evaluations. This led to what are known as the drug efficacy amendments that were passed by Senator Estes Kefauver in the late 1960s, or in the early 1960s, sorry, which established for the very first time the idea that drugs have to be proven for efficacy. And when I first learned this, I thought that was crazy, that it literally was not until 1962 that drug companies had to prove that drugs worked. But that's factually accurate. There was no law sort of mandating that up to that time. Look, I discussed the kind of paradoxical result of this change, that the beagle became sort of universal. On the one hand, protecting people from a large number of dangerous drugs. There are almost certainly dangerous treatments that were stopped through beagle testing. On the flip side, there are a lot of drugs that we now know work very differently in beagle dogs than they do in human bodies. And so there are also a number of treatments that may have been taken off the market that actually weren't that dangerous with people. So there is this paradoxical situation where it probably saved some people, it may have actually harmed others. And that's one of the long-term challenges in thinking about beagles in scientific research. It's also important to recognize that the dogs they were using for these projects were not these old-fashioned, beautifully painted beagles from the British countryside. They were a new population of carefully bred, sort of standardized scientific animals produced by a few sort of medium to large-scale breeders. Probably the largest of these is Marshall Farms or Marshall Bioresources. And in the late 1990s, as you can see in this advertisement, the Marshall Beagle was kind of sold as this commodity, quote, a global standard with the papers to prove it. The old system of finding stray dogs and doing research on them had kind of disappeared, and it had been replaced by this mass production model of sort of mass standardized or semi-standardized beagle dogs. They were sort of still a technology, but now they were a kind of scientific commodity. They were literally trademarked, the Marshall Beagle. It's like a specific kind of beagle. So this gets us mostly to the present, where the picture has changed a little bit further. And something I think really interesting has changed in our discussion and use of laboratory dogs over the last 2 decades. The traditional benefits of using a kind of laboratory dog, that they're standardized, consistent, sort of inbred, these things no longer seem quite so valuable. And in fact, they've started to undermine the status of the beagle. The fact that beagles are really cute and really charming is one of the main reasons that people are so critical of their use in biomedical research. People do not get so upset about the widespread use of pigs in biomedical research because people do not generally think pigs are as cute as they think adorable beagles are. So I'll end by talking a little bit about what's been changing over the last 2 decades. Back in 1970, though, someone reviewed Anderson's book on beagles, this kind of beagle Bible, and they made a critical point. So this researcher, John Paul Scott, he argued that Anderson's book was good, it was valuable, it was useful. But, quote, however useful the beagle may be, to adopt this breed as the laboratory dog in the same way as the albino rat would be a serious error, for it would throw away the chief unique advantage of dogs, namely their genetic variation. So choosing only beagles, he was saying, kind of missed out on the complexity of canine life, the thing that made dogs so interesting, all these different breeds, all these different behaviors. And actually the same year, a psychologist named Martin Seligman, who some of you may have heard of, and his colleague Dennis Groves kind of discovered the same thing accidentally. So they were studying the phenomenon that's now known as learned helplessness, which involved sort of subjecting dogs to a small shock and seeing how they adapted their behavior. And what they found was that a portion of laboratory-bred beagles that they had learned helplessness really quickly. So the beagles just gave up really, really quickly and kind of accepted their lot, accepted the shock. But a population of kind of stray dogs that they had found on the street resisted learned helplessness a lot longer than the beagles did. So there seemed to be something kind of different with this laboratory population of dogs and these kind of free-roaming, sort of non-specialized, non-standard dogs. It seemed like maybe you did need to do research on different kinds of dogs. Seligman's study, though, was kind of rare, actually, for being one that thought about canine sort of psychology or canine cognitive capacity. Because up until the late 1970s, 1980s, nobody really thought dogs were complicated cognitive entities. This is a photo, as some of you might be able to guess, of Ivan Pavlov's, sort of the outside of Pavlov's laboratory. Everyone knows the famous dog ringing sort of bell conditioning studies, but it hadn't really progressed much further than that until the 1980s. Nobody really thought about dogs as having the ability to mentally time travel, to remember sort of complicated things they had seen in the past. These were considered to be sort of too complicated for dogs to be able to do. But in 1981, these two George Mason researchers looked at a bunch of dogs and a bunch of cats, and they found that actually dogs had higher object permanence than cats did. So people thought cats were kind of smarter in general, but it seemed like dogs were actually the smarter animal. They did a bunch of different tests, including this invisible displacement task, which you can see here. You kind of hide a ball, and then you switch where the ball is. And it relies on the animal being able to kind of mentally imagine the ball moving without seeing the ball moving. Cats are really bad at this. They just failed this task over and over again. But dogs, it turned out, were actually really good at doing this. And it made people think, OK, maybe we've kind of underestimated dogs a little bit. This was followed up about 10 years later by two psychologists, Sylvain Gagnon and François Doré, who were working in Quebec. And they had a larger subject population. They found basically the same thing, that dogs are actually quite good at this task. It depended a little bit on breed. Some breeds were a bit better than others. But in general, dogs seemed a little smarter than people had really understood before. This research in particular created what's now known as the dog paper boom of the 1990s. There was this just explosion of research on canine cognition in the early sort of mid-1990s, and a lot of what we know now about dog intelligence sort of emerged roughly during this period. One example of this is a changing idea of canine vision. It was thought for the longest time, based in particular on the work of this guy, Gordon Lynn Walls, that dogs could only see in black and white. This is a kind of common thing that you hear people saying. I remember hearing this as a kid. I don't know how widespread it is. It turns out this isn't true either. And a lot of research over the last couple decades has shown that dogs see on this more expansive color spectrum. So they see kind of yellows and blues and a kind of grayscale. And even there's interesting suggestions that they somehow perceive ultraviolet light that we can't see. So there's even a sense that maybe dogs have sort of different sort of visual capacities than humans do. So there's a lot of research that's been done on this. And it turns out that dogs are actually cognitively very complicated. Regular people started to learn this in particular because of this book, The Intelligence of Dogs by Stanley Coren. Coren wasn't really an experimental scientist, but he had sent out a survey to tons and tons of dog trainers, breeders, judges, et cetera, and kind of asked them to rate dogs on a scale of intelligence. And if you've ever heard that like a border collie is smarter than a pit bull, or that a poodle is the second smartest kind of dog, all of this like really goes back to Stanley Coren. He's the first person to kind of rank dogs on a level of intelligence. And this spreads this idea to the general public that there is this kind of hierarchy of canine intelligence. Beforehand, everybody just kind of thought all dogs were a little silly. And Coren actually says that when he was first training as a psychologist, the idea that he was taught was that every dog is a kind of beagle-shaped bag of reflexes, basically, right? That there was nothing going on inside, just a bunch of reflexes. So people knew so much about dogs, and this was happening as dog ownership is also exploding. So the 90s, the early 2000s, worldwide dog ownership is going up dramatically. More people have dogs as pets, more people are spending more money on their dogs as pets, so all of this is changing at roughly the same time. Now, you might be wondering, does living with a dog make you healthier? And this is just an interjection because this is a fascinating area of research. If you go online, you'll find a million articles saying the answer is obviously yes. But that's maybe not totally true. There was 3 years ago a kind of meta review of a lot of this research by some scientists in Tennessee found that there's no really consistently accurate answer to this question. So a lot of people say dogs make you happier, healthier, you exercise more, et cetera. There's also a lot of research that they stress you out, take a lot of your money, et cetera, et cetera. So there's not a really clear answer if it's better or worse to have a dog or not. That said, just this year, there's an interesting research in this journal, Geroscience, about how older individuals actually show sort of less cognitive aging if they have a companion dog or a companion pet around. So this is an active debate, and I think we'll learn a lot more about this in the coming years. If you've also read about dogs in science, you may well have seen a kind of story like this one, which is about how dogs are useful for kind of advancing our understanding of things like cancer or Alzheimer's. In the book, I have a big chapter about research on Alzheimer's. Since everyone is going to be just running to the back to buy that, I'm not going to, ruin it for you now. But one of the interesting areas, I think in particular, is this question of dogs as a kind of cancer research animal. So in these studies, I think what's interesting is not just that maybe dogs also have cancer, but that dogs might get cancer for the same reasons that we do. That they share our environment, they breathe the same air, they live in our homes. So they share this kind of entire lived environment that might be causing disease. And in my book, I refer to this as this idea of environmenticity, this notion that dogs increasingly in the 2000s become defined by sharing the human environment, that that's part of what makes them valuable, that they live in our homes, they are subject to all the same stressors. Like a dog that lives in a home with a smoker is likely to get secondhand tobacco exposures. That could be bad, and you can study that to understand human tobacco exposures, right? So this idea that the environmental kind of existence of dogs makes them valuable. And part of my argument is that this has really changed the value of the laboratory dog. If the value of a research dog is in its sharing of the human environment, the fact that it's been in a home or walked down a dirty city street, then you don't want a pure, inbred research animal that has never been outside before, right? So this traditional ideal of the classic experimental animal isn't so valuable in a world where you want this shared environmental existence. And you see this in a lot of different places. So one of the largest sort of active projects is this undertaking known as the Dog Aging Project, started at the University of Washington. And I think this photo even gets to this idea of environmenticity, this dog in this like field of potential allergens, maybe. I'm not sure what it's really suggesting. But I think what's fascinating about the Dog Aging Project, which has had a lot of sort of government funding, it's actually been fighting to maintain it, but is that they make a very clear argument that their research is not on captive dogs. So if you go to their website, they have these frequently asked question sections, and they say, are you conducting experiments on captive dogs? We do not conduct, nor are we associated with, any research on laboratory or captive dogs. So you get this division now between people who are researching a kind of one type of experimental dog and an older sort of model that's now being sort of treated as a bit outdated. Instead, they describe their project as kind of a community science, that it's this shared undertaking where a pet owner brings their dog in, lets them run some tests, reports on, how does the dog eat, how is it aging, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a different model of scientific research. Another version of this is this thing known as the Golden Retriever Lifetime Study by the Morris Animal Foundation. Similar kind of idea, how do dogs develop cancer? And if we learn that, maybe we'll learn how people develop cancer. So I think we could call this, in line with this exhibit ongoing, a kind of more than human medicine, right? It's this notion that there is a shared kind of medical universe that we and our companion animals are sharing, and that by studying both of these together, we can learn new insights. Researchers have also, though, been really explicit about the other values of this companion animal sort of model, this pet dog paradigm. One of those is that it lowers the cost of doing research. So they notice that if you don't have to keep dogs inside of a laboratory, the scientists don't have to pay for the food that those dogs eat. It's the pet owner who's feeding their own dog, so you're cutting out massive costs by working that way. Other researchers have also noticed that if people are volunteering their pet dog, you don't have to worry about those frisky animal activists showing up and sort of breaking into the laboratory and stealing your dogs, because those dogs just live in people's homes somewhere in the area. So there are a lot of reasons why this kind of approach is catching on. But what I argue in the book is that this new kind of idea of companion science is replacing the traditional mode of using dogs in scientific research. It's shifting how we relate to dogs, and it's influenced by the things that we've learned about dogs, that they're cognitively complicated creatures, that they're really cute, they're charming, we want to feed them, we want them to be healthy. This has kind of threatened the old traditional style of dog research. Nevertheless, we still get some of the same ideas. So the Dog Aging Project website has this little sub-tab where it describes dogs as science's best friend, right? And so it's virtually unchanged from the 1946 exhibit that I started out with, this idea of a kind of scientific companionship that transcends most of history. But this is a different vision of that friendship. And so what I hope you've taken from the talk so far is this idea that the very human-dog relationship has transformed a lot and pretty dramatically over the last century. Okay, I'll end here with a little note. So I think one question is, what should we do with all of this history? What should we think about all of the things that have happened? Are these horrible, or have they been valuable? Have they been effective? I think in my book, I wrote it in part because I wanted to avoid an oversimplification that I see sometimes in animal debates, that all animal research is pointless or it's all valuable, that it's either entirely unethical or it's totally ethical. I think it's really hard to draw these firm boundaries. Some of this research has changed our lives. People are alive today because of insulin research on dogs. Would we have discovered that some other way if we never did dog research? Possibly, but we just don't know, right? So the world that we live in has been shaped by these more than human medical relationships. And I think it's important for us to think about sort of sacrifices and what those mean for us and for the animals that are often the subject of sacrifice. And I'll end this with just maybe a goofy note that I don't know, maybe this is too silly, but whatever. In season 1 of this Amazon Prime TV show, Reacher, which I have to admit I like more than I should, the main character, who's this retired Army police officer, this huge hulking man in the front here, he finds a dog chained up outside a house, and the dog is not getting fed enough water, it's not getting fed enough food. This is like a moral affront to Reacher, and so he and his police friend confront the owner, and they kind of threaten him, like, we'll come back and make your life tough if you don't feed this dog better and treat this dog better. Now, this is reasonable, right? This is, it's reasonable to be upset about poor treatment of dogs, even though it's also a really modern vision of dog ownership, right? 70 years ago, keeping a dog outside was the sort of logical and predicted way of keeping a dog. So no one would have started a fight over a dog being tied outside and maybe not having enough water. Our relationship with dogs has changed a lot over time. The other reason why this jumped out at me is that if you've seen this show, and maybe watch it, maybe don't, the rest of this show is this main character, Reacher, just killing dozens, if not hundreds, of bad guys, just left and right, brutally, and often with minimal moral justification. Like, it's supposed to be justified, but you're frequently not really sure that Reacher is doing the right thing. So how do we square this kind of like moral absolute defense of canine mistreatment with this willingness to just willy-nilly kill humans if they're kind of on the side of the drug dealers or whatever? It's a bizarre ethical vision, but I think it's one that's really common in our world, and it's one that I think we should think more about, which is that some kinds of animal sacrifice have been accepted as normal and they have been normalized. Other kinds of animal sacrifice have been rejected and denormalized. If you go to the Department of War website right now, you will find this page about four-legged fighters, the over 1,000 animals that serve in the military abroad, that these are, you learn that these are highly skilled warriors. In the early 1940s, the idea was that these dogs were basically identical with the research animals that existed in university laboratories. These were all dogs that were kind of saving human lives. They were part of a shared undertaking to kind of make human life and American military power more capable. Today, these are totally separated. So this group of dogs, as far as I know, gets very minimal protest, whereas sort of animals in laboratories are frequently condemned as unnecessary. I think that's a fascinating kind of ethical and moral change that we've seen over roughly a century. And so I'll end with this little cartoon from 1956. So the San Francisco Chronicle, right around the time the University of California, Davis Beagle colony got started, included this little kind of opinion piece that I think is wonderful with this cartoon here. And it ends with a kind of apology. And I think this apology is fascinating. So it says, "We're very sorry that it's necessary for the beagle to act as a guinea pig in an experiment that involves our safety and well-being. He, the beagle, is a victim of man's inability to put a leash on the atom, and even more to the point, on himself. It is a tough test of the friendship of man's best friend, but perhaps the beagle is the best one to undergo it. If any friendship could survive the estimated 15 to 20 years of the test, it would be the friendship of the beagle toward his irresponsible master." So I think we remain caught in this same sort of logic of apologetic necessity, and I think we're still working through what a kind of moral and ethical relationship with dogs should look like and will look like. As I have said once before, I think solutions to the problem of animal experimentation require us to think differently about our social orders more generally. I think you cannot sort of save animals in one context without rethinking how we relate to animals at a much broader level. And so I'll end on that note, and I will just say thank you very much. Here's a dog kind of escaping an experiment. Thanks so much.